last Metroid is in captivity. The galaxy is at peace.
Metroid was not the juggernaut that Mario was. It didn't sell well in Japan. It was popular enough in the United States, so a sequel was commissioned. For the Game Boy, a solid-selling B player. The SNES was a flagship console at the time. The Game Boy was a hot, sexy side piece. It was cool, had strong sales, but just a glorified peripheral. Metroid was not taken seriously. Now, don't get me wrong, the Game Boy is a really great handheld, especially for the time. It just was that, a handheld. Hiroji Kayotake would move up from designer to director for the project. Hiroyuki Kimura would co-direct. Yoshio Sakamoto would not be involved with the project. Metroid 2 would take a more traditional approach by shrinking the explorable map into level-like areas. The next area wouldn't open up until all the Metroids were killed in the previous section. It was not a complete expansion of the ideas set by Metroid. It would add Metroid series staples like the space jump, spring ball, and save points, and Samus would get her iconic shoulder pads in the design for the Game Boy, because, like many other design choices in this era of gaming, it was one born of necessity. Metroid 2 would not define the Metroidvania style. For that matter, Metroid didn't define the Metroidvania style. That was a game cobbled together with sheer willpower and the digital equivalents of duct tape. Its convalescence into a semi-coherent product would set the groundwork for true greatness. While that wouldn't be realized in Metroid 2, it would be realized in Metroid 3. One of the best games of all time, with ironically pretty weak sales. Among fans, it reigns supreme. But maybe we are kinda wrong with this assessment. Maybe, just maybe, this isn't the best Metroid/Metroidvania. Of course, Super Metroid is a phenomenal game. Of course! But maybe it actually isn't the best Metroid game? I'll assuage the internet keyboard warriors who lie in wait to pounce and devour anyone over imagined slights because of a difference of opinion. I don't think I believe this. I'm kind of saying this to be controversial for the sake of controversy. But I ask of you, please stick with me as I use this video essay to explore the legitimacy of my own thoughts here. I like Super Metroid. I really like Super Metroid. But I want to take a somewhat contrarian view for the sake of taking a contrarian view to better explore what makes Super Metroid great and to better understand its contribution to the series and gaming as a whole. So here comes a possibly very loaded statement. Super Metroid is not the best Metroid game, because it's actually the first true Metroid game. April of 1994, Super Metroid launched on the SNES. Directed by Yoshio Sakamoto and produced by Makoto Kano, with programming done by the team at Intelligent Systems. Development took about 2.5 years, with the first year spent experimenting with ideas. Work started in the fall of 1991. Sakamoto was approached by Makoto Kano to make a new Metroid game for the Super Nintendo. A Super Metroid, if you will. Sakamoto agreed. He would retake the helm as the director of the project, and Makoto Kano would produce and take the lead on environmental design. Sakamoto's boss, Gunpei Yokoi, had encouraged his designers to not bother themselves with learning the technical aspects of the company's hardware. He didn't want creativity hampered by knowing the technology's limitations, which is understandable. But Sakamoto disagreed. He wanted to work closer with the programmers and engineers and have at least a basic understanding of how the hardware worked. In a developer interview with Super Metroid, Sakamoto explains, "With NES, what we could do is simple, but with Super NES, unless you put in a lot of thought beforehand and drew up thorough designs, things that should be possible would become impossible. For example, once development had made some progress, if I told a programmer to make something spin, he might say that it was no longer possible." Now with experienced designers, an established design philosophy and plan, added with the possibilities of new hardware, maybe, just maybe they could make something out of this fledgling franchise. While Super Metroid would be a direct sequel to Metroid and Metroid 2, the game would also act as a reboot/remake of the first Metroid game. For years, this title would be in a class of its own. Few games would imitate its design. It would be 8 years before we get another entry in the Metroid franchise, and it wouldn't be until 2009 with the game Shadow Complex that the Metroidvania design style would truly explode, setting the stage for games like Guacamelee, Ori, Axiom Verge, and Hollow Knight, just to name a few. In the interim, we did get some Castlevania games, which was great, and that's why we have the Vania part of Metroidvania, but it's not like the amount of Metroidvanias we're getting today. We just got a few. Super Metroid set the standard, the bar that every other Metroidvania game would be compared to. Here's the thing with Super Metroid though. It's a strange relic of its time, a game that could only have been made on the Super Nintendo in the early 1990s. Let me unpack this. Super Nintendo games are an aesthetic that can only be fully realized on the Super Nintendo hardware. Super Metroid is the epitome of this aesthetic. The gameplay and world design can be replicated, integrated, and improved upon. The wrapping it comes in is unique to the era and hardware. It's like vinyl. Any attempt to emulate the feeling of that sound is a poor substitution for the real thing. Likewise, any attempt to emulate the total aesthetic and feel of Super Metroid, and specifically how it played on the Super Nintendo, doesn't always land. Doesn't mean the games that do that are bad games or complete failures. Their motifs are what they are, an homage done through imitation. Super Metroid is a fantastic game. It is firing on all cylinders. Its art direction is fantastic. The graphics are almost incomparable to any other at its time. I mean, Samus's feet splash water on soggy ground, and bubbles pop out of her helmet when under the water. It's detailed. But its art direction that builds the look and feel of the game cannot be adequately replicated outside of the confines of its original hardware requirements. You can fake it, but it doesn't always mean you're gonna make it. You can't completely replicate the past, you can only reference it. Super Metroid is a game that could only come from its time. Design-wise, Super Metroid gets right what Metroid got wrong, which isn't fair to say because Metroid never truly had a shot to get it right. But to grant Super Metroid the title of the best might not be fair. While it may technically be the third title of the franchise, it's in all actuality the very first true Metroid game, and would set the standard in a variety of ways for all Metroid and Metroidvania games that followed it, but also would be outclassed level by level, even by its own sequels. The main inspiration for Metroid on the NES was a movie. So naturally, the SNES entry, Sakamoto wanted to create something more cinematic. Super Metroid is filled with large cinematic moments that complement the interactivity of a video game. The HUD is even designed in a way that makes the viewable play area more rectangular for a widescreen feel. Sakamoto wanted to tell a cinematic story within the confines of interesting and compelling gameplay. Video games on consoles at this time were beginning to focus more on narrative design. Final Fantasy, Secret of Mana, Chrono Trigger all featured more developed narratives. A fleshed out story was becoming the norm. Even the Home Improvement game opened up with a long-winded prologue to set the stage. Pun intended. Where Super Metroid differs from Squaresoft and Enix's RPGs from the time is one, it's not an RPG, in the literal sense at least, and two, there's no dialogue except for the opening prologue. Super Metroid does what most movies should do. Show, don't tell. Most of Super Metroid's story is told through its environments. When you first get to the space station prologue, the baby Metroid from the opening is gone, and the scientists are dead. Ridley appears, you fight a losing battle, and he takes the Metroid with him to Zebes. A quick aside here, is it Zebes or Zebes? I grew up pronouncing it as Zebes, so it sounds weird to me to say Zebes. We didn't have the internet at the time to correct us, or voice acting to pronounce everything for us, so I'm just gonna alternate between the two pronunciations to make everyone mad. When you arrive on Zebes and you first descend into Brinstar, there are no enemies. Everything is eerily quiet. You venture through the destroyed remains of Old Turian that blew up at the end of the first Metroid, a nice wink and nod to the fans who played the original. Here it becomes very obvious that you are being watched. Reascending to Criteria and going back up through Old Turian, the space pirates are now out in force to take you down. They have been alerted to your presence. These opening moments show you that your first mission to Zebes was not a success you thought it was. The pirates have rebuilt, they are up to no good, and they have the baby Metroid. You must now find their new base of operations on Zebes and put an end to their plans. All of this is told through the art direction and game design. Super Metroid shows, it doesn't tell, and it does it really, really well. Hey, that rhymed! How fun. In Meridia, you get worried when you see the space pirates are kind of successful in recreating Metroids. You're heartbroken when you defeat Ridley and find the baby Metroid isn't there. And you are relieved when you find the baby Metroid in New Turian and it recognizes you right before killing you. Then heartbroken again when it sacrifices itself to save your life, enabling you to defeat Mother Brain's reincarnated mechanical form. Super Metroid did story beats and had excellent world building. You get to know Zebes, the pirates, and even some hints about the Chozo. Or is it Kozo? I always pronounced it with a K, like chasm. I don't know why, it's just what my brain did. Maybe because it's followed by a vowel? I don't know, but choose is also followed by a vowel? I don't know, I don't say coos? I don't... Words in English are hard, I don't know. Here's the thing, I think other Metroid games actually do this storytelling better. Specifically, Zero Mission. Metroid Zero Mission on the Game Boy Advance does a better job at its storytelling. The same amount of dialogue, if not less. And while it does add cutscenes per se, they are minimal while still telling a whole complete and interesting story. We get more about the space pirates and what they're doing on Zebes. We learn more about Samus, her origins, and what the Chozo expect from her. We even get some clues as to the origin of her super suit when she loses it and has to earn it back.
Where's my super suit?
What?
Where is my super suit?
We even get a longer sequence of feeling super powerful with the gravity suit. Super Metroid isn't the best Metroid to tell an engaging story. It's simply the first. Metroid's movement is a weird mix of too floaty, but also tight and adjustable. Samus doesn't move like Mario, and isn't as tight and crunchy. But her physics are more than just adequate. If coming from a Mario game, you may have to take a moment to readjust your platforming prowess, but she still does feel pretty good to control. In Super Metroid, Samus's movement and physics are better honed in, but it still has that oxymoronic feel of heavy floatiness. Unlike Mario though, at least in the 16-bit era, Samus has a few more moves and nuances to her agility that aid in her traversal skills through the game world. You have two choices for your jump. You can jump straight up and have a little more control of her movement in the air. There's more height and more maneuverability to ascend up small platforms. But if you jump while moving left or right, Samus does a somersault. She doesn't get as high, but does go further. When you have the space jump, that somersault can turn into an infinite jump, and then the screw attack makes the somersault a weapon. There's a couple of other things that Super Metroid adds to Samus's movements. First, she can wall jump, but that's not an easy feat. It's weirdly complicated in how it works, and it takes a moment to get the hang of. But if you practice and you get really good at performing it, world's your oyster. Thankfully, it's not completely necessary, and when it is, only for a moment. Then there is Shine Sparking, which is a feature of the Speed Booster ability. When you reach maximum speed, you turn into a mostly unstoppable force of destruction. If you hit crouch, you can stop movement while still keeping the speed boost active. Hit the jump button to jump up indefinitely until you hit an unbreakable barrier. Or you can hit jump and then a direction to fly into that direction. There's a cost though. The longer you Shine Spark, the more energy it drains from your health. And then there's also bomb jumping. I'm not sure if the developers intended this to be in there or not, but it's there. If you time your bomb planting just right, you can jump for almost an infinite amount of height. This can become necessary if you want a sequence break. More on that later. To be able to discover the whole of the game, you had to get good at controlling Samus. For players wanting to also challenge themselves to sequence break, get upgrades earlier than you're supposed to, you can improve your skills with Samus's abilities, like mastering the wall jump to get to Kraid earlier. But once again, I think Metroid Zero Mission made Samus more nimble without sacrificing that choice and difference of her jump, and she's snappier and controls better. She doesn't have the floaty weight that Metroid and Super Metroid have. And there are more ways to utilize the skills you master. and controls were more responsive than Super Metroid. Will Super Metroid introduced a lot of these new skills for players to use and master and exploit vulnerabilities with? Metroid Zero Mission? I think it did it better. The original Metroid had a fairly simple layout, comparatively speaking here. In Super Metroid, the developers redesigned the whole world from top to bottom. There are a few familiar areas, mostly as a wink and nod to fans of the original, but aside from the small section in Brinstar, the whole world is completely rethought. Brinstar is still the glue that holds everything in the map together, but instead of starting in Brinstar, you now start at the surface of the planet Criteria. These two sections act as the main hubs to traverse between the others, and just about everything is interconnected to each other, with only Norfair having a single access point. And now, since the developers had more time to really think out level design, sections and rooms have a distinct and unique feel, making it easier to navigate the world. Despite the fact that areas are more identifiable, the increase in size and complexity can make it harder to navigate and traverse. So Sakamoto and his team did something unique. They gave you a large, sprawling world to explore, and then boxed you in, only opening up a little at a time, and then sometimes reclosing the world behind you, trapping you in another, smaller area. At the start of the game, only a small section is available to explore. You can only go down to Brinstar to get the Morph Ball. Along the way, you'll see some other areas that might entice you to check them out, like the tunnel that you can't fit in, and the red door you can't open yet with your normal arm cannon. Once you get the Morph Ball, only a little more of the map opens up, so we may continue forward further into Brinstar. We enter a room with a red door and what looks like a fragile floor with an area below. Those of us who played the original Metroid know that we can bomb that floor. But we don't have bombs yet, but we can shoot down, so you might shoot out the floor, head down, and get the new upgrade, the missile tank. Now you can open up that red door you literally just saw. Continue a little further where you reach another missile tank, and a dead end. The only path forward is now backwards. So we go back up to Criteria. We can now access the map room, a save room, and this room that you can roll into a tunnel before you're stopped by a block. Ascend to the top where the original tunnel is, fight your first boss, and get the bombs. This opens up that one path to get another missile upgrade, and more of Criteria is explorable to get another entrance to Brinstar. Once again, only a small area is accessible. You can reach the map room, a recharge station, a save room, a couple missile upgrades, the charge beam, and the first mini-boss. While exploring to find these things, you'll probably find a green door that your missiles won't open, and neither does a charge beam if you found that. The only direction is to go and fight the Spore Spawn, which leads to the super missile upgrades, which now opens those green doors you saw. You continue forward to find this pillar, and there's a blue switch, kind of enticing you to shoot it. So you shoot it, and it opens, so you go through it. Once you exit the other side, you can try to backtrack, but the door traps you there. You're stuck. You can't go back. So you go forward, into this room that you have to run through to keep the floor from collapsing beneath you. Once through this section, you come to a shaft. You can't go up. You can't jump high enough. You can only go down. So you go down. You're stuck, confined to a small area once again. The map closed in behind you. The next sequence adds a complication. You'll be ping-ponging back and forth. You'll find the section with a monster head you can't quite reach. Once again, you still can't jump high enough. So you descend into Norfair, where you find a few more dead ends. A room that's too hot for you to go in, a room with a series of doors you're too slow to get through, and a room with blocks that can't be destroyed by bombs. They have a different, strange symbol on them. The only path that's open leads you to the high jump. Now we can reach that scary head. You fight Kraid, you get the Varia suit. Go back to Norfair, you can enter that hot room, and more of Norfair is explorable. But you have to take a long path around to get the speed booster. Hey, that looks like the symbol we saw earlier. And we're fast enough to outrun the doors, which leads us to the ice beam. And with the ice beam, we can freeze enemies and use them as platforms, which reopens the way back through Brinstar. But you can't go the exact way you came because of that one-way door. Remember this room that we couldn't jump high enough to ascend and could only go down? Now we can reach that ledge and ascend, get the power bombs, and loop up to the surface and wind up right back at our ship. Now the gloves are off. Super Metroid will no longer hold your hand guiding you. There isn't one obvious path. You have to find it yourself. but these opening sequences have given you the knowledge on how to discover that path. The design and flow of Zebes has gone from linear to non-linear without ever feeling overwhelming, and it taught you some things along the way. The path forward is sometimes backwards. There'll be optional secret items and extra power-ups to find. The more items and upgrades you find, the more the world folds in on itself, creating loops and shortcuts. This design set the standard for the Metroidvania map. And here's a fun fact, it's also breakable. You don't have to do the exact sequence laid out by the developers. If you master the wall jump, you can use it to reach the platform to enter Kraid's lair before you get the space jump. Master bomb jumping and you can get a lot of other items early. While sequence breaking wasn't in the original design, when discovered, the developers leaned into it. Even if you sequence break to skip sections or upgrades, you actually can't get stuck in any part of the game. While the sequence can be broken, the game can't. But I would argue that Metroid Dread and Metroid Zero Mission do map design a little better than Super Metroid. Heresy!
Have you been reading heresy recently? Unacceptable.
In Metroid Dread and Zero Mission, sequence breaking is baked right into the design. They follow the philosophy and standards set by Super Metroid, but they do two things better. One, the map is more interconnected. In Dread, there are multiple ways to get in and out of each area, making backtracking less of a hassle, and the world opens and closes in on itself multiple times before fully opening up. And even when it does fully open up, the world is constantly changing and moving, never getting stale as you make your way to the surface. For Zero Mission, the world of Zebes is also more interconnected than in Super Metroid. Norfair has more than one entrance and exit to it, and the map as a whole has more shortcuts and loops. And two, both games have baked in sequence breaks. In Dread, it is expected you would attempt to get certain items before you could or should. There's even a secret way to defeat Kraid if you broke the sequence and got the bombs early. And the way that world opens and closes, changes and folds in on itself, it's more interesting and a more compelling, more thoughtfully designed world. In Zero Mission, you can skip the long beam if you know about the secret to bypass its necessity, though it makes the game unnecessarily hard. Bomb jumping was removed in Fusion and then put back in Zero Mission. The added abilities to the Shine Spark create new ways of accomplishing sequence breaks. Between the abilities and the map design, sequence breaking wasn't an afterthought. It was part of the design plan for these games. Thus, one-upping Super Metroid in my opinion. I think I've made it clear in this video about Super Metroid that Metroid Zero Mission is actually my favorite Metroid game. But this isn't a video about Zero Mission. It's a video about Super Metroid. Specifically, how Super Metroid probably isn't the best Metroid game because it's actually, in all reality, the first Metroid game. I fully understand the foolishness of trying to take a legendary game down a peg.
You come at the king, you best not miss.
And I will admit this myself, my argument is probably a big whiff. While I subjectively like Zero Mission more than Super Metroid, I objectively can't say with a straight face that it's the better game. Mainly because nothing can truly take on the godfather of the Metroidvania subgenre. Super Metroid is truly the first of its kind. Metroid and Metroid 2 were just dry runs.
Just there's so many poorly chosen words in that sentence.
They were experiments looking to break the level-by-level formula of side-scrolling action platformers of the day. Super Metroid would be the defining work that would set the stage. Just about every other game of its ilk uses Super Metroid as the base. While I do not view it as the absolute untouchable best,
You buy yourself a tape recorder, you just record yourself for a whole day. I think you're going to be surprised at some of your phrasing.
I do accredit the game for its significant value. Super Metroid is a foundation that holds the subgenre together. Every other game is standing on this giant's shoulders. Super Metroid is expertly and masterfully designed. It also has a juicy and delicious SNES aesthetic, an aesthetic that cannot be touched or topped. I don't know of another console whose games have as much of a beloved, cherished, and rich aesthetic as Nintendo's sophomore outing in the home console market. A great amount of credit for Super Metroid's charm is owed to the hardware it was designed for. We're never going to get another game of this caliber again unless it is designed specifically and exclusively for a system that is more than 30 years old. How could you possibly accomplish that? Super Metroid is an unbeatable Goliath, and here I am completely undermining my own argument at the conclusion of this video. I know it is foolish to tear down what I've spent the past 20 minutes trying to build, but if I can admit that my attempt to tear down an idol is a fool's errand, could you take a precious second to entertain the tiniest notion that maybe, just maybe, this idiot on the internet just might be right?